Good evening, everybody. My name is Holly, and I'm the programs coordinator at the Osgood Township Museum. In addition to our speaker tonight, I'll also be joined by our executive director, James, who will also be assisting with any tech issues that come up because there's always something, and things like that for the evening. The Osgood Township Museum acknowledges that our museum, located in Vernon, Ontario, just south of Ottawa, is on the traditional unceded ancestral land of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. Algonquin and Anishinaabe are the original inhabitants of this territory along the Ottawa, Rideau, and Castor rivers and have lived on this land since time immemorial. We are grateful to be gathering here today to share stories as generations before us also have. So if you've never been to the museum before, the Osgood Township Museum tells the story of Ottawa's agricultural and rural history in the former Osgood Township. We're open all year, and we have a few events left before our winter holiday break. Tonight, of course, being one of them. So just to share what's kind of coming up next, on December 1st, starting at 4 p.m., we have our last program of the year at the museum, which is our tree lighting. There will be free popcorn and free hot chocolate, kids craft, and photos with Santa and Mrs. Claus. And if you attended our previous emotional support chicken knitting workshops, there was a virtual one in October and an in-person one earlier this month. There will be a couple photo shoot locations around the museum to take festive photos with your knitted chickens, just as a fun kind of wrap up to that program series. We're also running something that we're very excited about. It's our first year doing this, our holiday fundraising campaign, Adopt an Artifact. So for a $10 donation, you can symbolically adopt a museum artifact for the year. You will, of course, receive an official certificate of adoption, and all of the money that we raise through your donations will basically be going back into materials for the collection and ongoing collections care costs. So it's a really fun way to get involved and to learn a little bit more about local history. And we are excited because if you're inspired by tonight's presentation, we do have a laundry manual that is up for adoption. So if you want to learn more about that, just send me an email. And if there's anything else that kind of piques your interest from the collection that Sarah's showing off tonight, you can just let us know. But basically how it'll work is if you donate through the online page, just be sure to include your email so I can get in touch with you with next steps regarding the process. And if you're local, if you're around the Ottawa area, a kind of bonus, you can come in person. We have a bit of a catalog, quote unquote. You can actually pick your artifact yourself. So there's a few incentives. If you haven't been to the museum recently, you want to check it out, you want to adopt an artifact, you can come by. So yeah, basically just send me an email if you have any questions about that, and I'll make sure to put that information in the chat just as we get started. So just some housekeeping. I will be moderating the chat throughout Sarah's talk. So if there's any questions that you have in the moment, just type them out and I'll be sure to circle back to them during our Q&A session at the end of the presentation. And without further ado, I'd like to officially announce tonight's speaker. Sarah Verreault is the collections officer at the Osgood Township Museum, so me and James's coworker. She has 14 years of experience in museums, primarily working in collections and in living history. She has a BA in Histoire from Laurentian University and an MA in Museum Studies from the University of Leicester. Outside of her professional interest in collections care and documentation, she has a personal interest in fashion history, learning historic skills, and the interpretation of working class heritage. So I will pass the virtual mic to Sarah so she can take us through her wonderful research.
So before we get started, I wanted to highlight that some of the images and objects that you'll be seeing on screen have this caption at the bottom, OTM, and a number. The number or accession numbers that are how we keep track of objects within the collection. But OTM stands for Osgood Township Museum. So these images and objects come from our collection. So tonight, I will be talking about a form of labor that is historically heavily feminized. It's a form of labor I've only ever experienced in very limited, very controlled settings, so it feels important to start by allowing a woman who lived it describe her experience in her own words. So in October 1923, The Progressive, a newspaper out of Saskatoon, published the following piece in their Of Interest to Women section under the headline, The Jolly Life of the Farmer's Wife. The farmer's wife has no excuse for not being cultured and up to date. All she has to do is cook the meal and wash the dishes and sweep the carpets and mop the floors and scrub the steps and wash the clothes and iron the linen and mend socks and patch pants and milk the cows and churn the butter and feed the chickens and bathe the children and tend the garden, and water the flowers, and can the fruit, and cut the children's hair, and set the dog on the tramps, and chase the cat out of the milk house, and polish the silverware, and blacken the stove, and straighten the window shades, and settle the children's scraps, and clean out the attic, and dicker with the ragman, and repaper the pantry shelves, and shoo the chickens off the porch, and wipe up the mud father and the boys track in, and bake bread, and make the cakes, and shake the rugs, and beat the carpets, and dust the furniture, and drive the pigs out of the garden, and answer the telephone, and sift the ants out of the sugar, air the feather beds, and get the men folk up in the morning, and gather the eggs, and set the hens, and order groceries, and keep the neighbor's baby while she goes to town, and get the children off to school, and get rid of insurance men, and fight off book agents, and trim the lamps, and swat the flies, and split the kindling, and start the fires, and empty the ash can, and rake the lawn, and make the beds, and string the beans, and sort the apples, and keep track of the men's folk collar buttons, and carry in the stove wood, and pick the geese, and make pies, and write a letter to mother. Then, in the afternoon, she can go to missionary meeting and work her head off for the heathens. The piece is signed simply A.W. Macy. Of the 345 words I just read to you, for the next 40-odd minutes, I'll be focusing on these 7. Wash the clothes and iron the linen. I'll be focusing more specifically on domestic laundry during the 19th and 20th centuries. My goal is to weave together development in technology, social changes, and their impact on the process of doing the laundry. We'll start with an overview of the tools and techniques and experience of laundry for people entering the 19th century. Then we'll look at the work itself. The quote-unquote correct way to do the laundry varies from family to family, generation to generation, and culture to culture. But my goal is to give a general outline using advice books and textbooks. As we move further into the 20th century, I'll talk about how things like electrification and women's work outside the home did, or didn't, affect the adoption of new technology and work processes. The promise over and over again was that new products would lighten the work of wives and mothers. My question is, did that happen? Did the board do the work? Before we can get into how to clean, we need to talk about what is being cleaned. Table linens, bed linens have not changed very much, though they were commonly made of linen, thus the name. But clothing has changed a lot over the last 200 years. So join me for a very quick, very dirty tour of fashion history. Starting from the skin out, in the 19th century, the base layer for men was the shirt, and for women the shift or chemise. Drawers for women and men became popular in the middle of the century. In the late 1870s, a new all-in-one garment was introduced, the combinations. In this period, underwear was more and more commonly made of cotton and silk linen. For women, became increasingly frilly and lacy.
Romanenko was hired.
By the end of the century, knit-wool combinations also became increasingly popular. They didn't fully replace the separate chemise and drawers until the 1910s, when changes in support garments required new layers. The chemise and combinations served to absorb body sweat and protect the corset. Corsets were one way for Victorians to shape their bodies into a fashionable silhouette. The most commonly worn corsets were made of strong fabric and could be reinforced with cording, whalebone, or steel. They were designed to support and smooth the body, and very few women used them to dramatically reduce their waist size. They were difficult to clean, however, and would have been spot treated rather than washed. In the 1910s, fashion moved towards an underbust style, the separate bra to cover the breasts. These corsets would shift into girdles worn through the middle of the 20th century. Bras and panties replaced the combinations in corsets, though their shapes and material continued to evolve with fashion. To maintain a smooth line, women wore corset covers in later slips. Another Victorian method to transform the body was petticoats, cages, and bustles. Fashion in the 1800s and 1810s was very straight and columnal, but in the 1820s, skirts ballooned back out into a bell shape. This was created by layers and layers of starched, corded, or horsehair petticoats and small padded bustles. In the 1850s, fashionable ladies started wearing cages. They were linen or cotton petticoats inserted with hoops of whalebone or steel. This allowed skirts to get bigger and take on more structural shapes. In the 1880s, women used smaller horsehair or wire bustles. The bustle became even smaller in the 1890s, using layers of padding rather than wire, before disappearing in the 1900s as skirts fit closely over the hips and hems transitioned between narrow and A-lined throughout the 20th century. The standard man's outfit consisted of a coat, waistcoat, trousers, and a shirt. In the first few decades of the 19th century, men's clothes were colorful and displayed the body. As the century progressed, however, middle-class social expectations moved men away from anything that might be perceived as ostentatious or effeminate. Waistcoats maintained their rich embroidery and brightly patterned silks until the middle of the century, but trousers and coats, usually made of woolen cloth, rapidly narrowed into shades of black, dark blue, brown, and green. Shapes and silhouettes did change, but it does take a different kind of nerd than I am to explain them. Collars and cuffs could be made separate from the shirt, as well as sewn on. Men's suits became increasingly boxy in the 20th century, reaching their peak box in the 40s and 50s, before slimming back down in the 60s and 70s. Women's fashion changed dramatically over the same time period. Skirts and sleeves expanded and deflated, waistlines rose and fell. For working women, skirts rose high enough to not need to lift them when going up and down stairs, but in the daytime, everyone wore long sleeves and high necklines. Synthetic dyes appear in clothing in the 1860s, but all cloth remained natural fibers. Women displayed their money, personalities, and quote-unquote good taste through layers of ruffles, ribbons, lace, fur, and feathers on their dresses, but also their hats, coats, and accessories. Even women in rural areas would have had access to trains into cities if there was one nearby, as well as general stores, newspapers, ladies' magazines, and catalogs to keep up with the latest fashions. The end of the First World War marks a rapid change in fashion towards the loose, boyish fit of the 1920s and the natural curves of 30s bias cut dresses. The 40s are square-shouldered, and hemlines rise to just below the knee. The 1950s returned to feminine, hourglass styles. The 1960s transformed the history of fashion with a miniskirt, and in the 70s, women finally fully adopt the controversial garment, the all-occasion pant. Rayon, a semi-synthetic fiber made from cellulose, was invented in 1892. It was initially referred to as synthetic silks under all kinds of different brand names, and became an immensely popular alternative to natural fibers through the middle of the 20th century. Nylon is presented at the 1939 World's Fair as the first fully man-made fiber. Polyester is invented in 1946, acrylic in 1955, and spandex in 1958. These synthetic fabrics quickly dominated the factory-made, store-bought, ready-to-wear market. They were first marketed as marvelous science, as being cheaper, but also specifically easier to clean. Now that we know what we are cleaning, let's jump back a couple hundred years. The basic process of laundry remained relatively consistent since humans started to wear clothes. In Europe, the clothes were soaked in lye, washed in a river, tank, or tub, then treaded or pounded with a stone or wooden bat, rinsed, wrung, and flattened, and laid out to dry. Soap was expensive until the 19th century and reserved for delicate items. Most used other detergents composed of lye and some other additives like human and or animal urine, both rich sources of ammonia. Lye itself was created through a long process of boiling and straining to leach out alkali from wood ash. Alkali, which forms the base of soap even today, bonds with oily particles in cloth and makes them dissolvable in water. The carved washboard is, perhaps surprisingly, a late 18th, early 19th century invention, originating in Scandinavia. Before then, mechanical washing, that is to say, forcing water and dirt through the fibers, would have been accomplished by treading, literally stomping with your feet, by kneading the piece of cloth like bread against a smooth wood board, or beating it against some rocks with a washing bat. Bats or beaters are exactly what they sound like. Bats carved out of a piece of hardwood, a flat paddle at one end, and a round handle at the other. England, they were mostly plain or with grooves carved in one side to act as a scrub board. In Northwest Europe, however, they could be highly decorative. Beetles were a round, club-like alternative to the bat. In In the late 18th century, people also began using dollies to plunge, stir, and pound, working detergent fluid through the clothes in a wash tub. Fully wood dollies eventually evolved into metal plungers, like the ones we have in the collection. Nearly everyone, regardless of class, in 18th century France, England, and North America, would have gotten outside assistance for their laundry. Two social histories focused on Paris, for example, found very few tools for laundry in 18th century domestic inventories. In England, the wealthiest families would have employed full-time washerwomen, as well as brought in additional women for big washes, but even modest families brought in help. Richard and Anne Latham were small yeoman farmers, meaning that they owned the land that they farmed in Lancashire and northern England. Richard maintained a household account book between 1724 and 1767, through which we can see that their yearly expenses ranged between 20 and 40 pounds. Not wealthy, but not poor. We can also see that they periodically paid local people of that same standing for labor, including for washing. Additionally, clothing items or cloth made to make clothes were their most important purchase after food, not because they were buying a lot, but because clothing was just that expensive, giving them that added incentive to maintain what they had. For all classes, clothes were important for warmth and comfort, but they were also markers of status and a form of conspicuous consumption, an opportunity to wear your money and social connections. Clean clothing in particular were markers of social and moral worth. There is a commonly held belief, even among historians, that before the 19th century, people believed that linens served as a surrogate for washing the body. Historian Susan North uses medical journals, advice literature, and household manuals to argue that washing the body and the linen were equally valued and desired. She describes a, quote, cleanliness triage. When forced by lack of time and or resources, an early modern English person probably focused on the visible hands, face, neckwear, headwear, and cuffs first, requiring a bit more time and water. The washing of the invisible skin came next, and finally, the invisible linen that needed considerably more time, resources, labor, and expense. For the poor, clothes were also investments. If hard times hit, you could always sell or pawn your clothes. Despite all this social weight, very little social capital transferred over to the women who actually did the labor. Laundry in 18th century England was part of the, quote, makeshift economy. In other words, the strategies of those seeking whatever means they could to survive. The skills were learned easily, you needed a few basic items, and you could work from out of your own home and provide some small addition to income. Emphasis on small. Pay was low because the occupation was overcrowded and competitive for comparatively smaller number of clients. The work was unreliable and depended on fluctuating demand, weather, and illness. It would have to be combined with other sources of income, such as sewing and crime. If you're struggling to make ends meet one week, you could always slip a few stockings to the pawn shop. The washerwomen were at increased risk of assault and theft for the same reason. For many women, laundry was the last resort when their husband had died, deserted, did not earn enough, or was unemployed. There were accounts of successful businesswomen, but there were exceptions. It also shouldn't be left implied. The work was awful. In 1730, Stephen Duck used the Georgic poetic form, with its traditional emphasis on idyllic nature, to recenter the agricultural workers who actually lived in the English countryside. His poem, The Thresher's Labor, only mentions women to complain that they talk too much, and they don't make sense, and they don't take this threshing business very seriously. In 1739, Mary Collier, a woman who lived and worked in South rural England her entire life, including as a washerwoman, responded with her own Georgic poem, The Woman's Labor, an epistle to Mr. Stephen Duck, and sharply political in its call for women's labor to be respected and for women to be educated. But I will share her description of her work as a washerwoman.
When bright Orion glitters in the skies, in winter nights then early we must rise. The weather ne'er so bad, wind, rain, or snow, our work appointed, we must rise and go. While you on easy beds may lie and sleep, till light does through your chamber windows peep. When to the house we come where we should go, how to get in, alas, we do not know. The maid quite tired with work the day before, or come with sleep, we standing at the door, oppressed with cold, and often call in vain, ere to our work we can admittance gain. But when from wind and weather we get in, briskly with courage we our work begin. Heaps of fine linen we before us view, whereon to lay our strength and patience too. Cambrics and muslins, which our ladies wear, lace and edgings, costly, fine, and rare, which must be washed with utmost skill and care, with holland shirts, ruffles, and fringes too, fashions which our forefathers never knew. For several hours here we work and slave, before we can one glimpse of daylight have. We labor hard before the morning's past, because we fear the time runs on too fast. At length bright Sol illuminates the skies, and summons drowsy mortals to arise. Then comes our mistress to us without fail, and in her hand, perhaps, a mug of ale, to cheer our hearts and also to inform herself what work is done that very morn. Lays her commands upon us that we mind her linen well, nor leave the dirt behind. Not this alone, but also to take care we don't her cambrics nor her ruffles tear, and these most strictly does of us require, to save her soap and sparing be of fire. Tells us her charge is great, nay, furthermore, her clothes are fewer than the time before. Now we drive on, resolved our strength to try, and what we can do most willingly, until the heat and work 'tis often known, not only sweat but blood runs trickling down. Our wrists and fingers still our work demands, the constant action of our laboring hands. Now night comes on from whence you have relief, but that, alas, does not increase our grief. With heavy hearts we often view the sun, fearing he'll set before our work is done. For either in the morning or at night we piece the summer's day with candlelight. Though we all day with care our work attend, such is our fare, we not know when 'twill end. When evenings come, you homeward take your way, we till our work is done are forced to stay. And after all our toil and labor past, 6 pence or 8 pence pays us off at last. For all our pains no prospect we can see, attend us but old age and poverty.
In New France and British North America, labor was scarce. Servants in general had more opportunities for mobility and did not show the same deference for class hierarchies as in the Old World, allowing some ability to negotiate wages. The working conditions were just as terrible, however, and carried the same social stigmas. So while I haven't found specific studies of washerwomen in Canada, I think it's fair to assume they would have more in common with Mary's experience than not. So we've talked about some of the tools, we've gone over some of the social history. Let's get into the dirty laundry. If you lived in the 19th century, how would you clean your clothes? I'll be pulling from advice manuals and household science textbooks from 1815 to 1905. I'll talk more about why I chose this kind of source later, but for now, wash day is approaching fast. As public school household science says, as the first essential of laundry work is a plentiful supply of water, a work concerning that necessary article may not be out of place. Nearly all the sources I looked at discuss the need to soften hard water using alkalis, such as soda or ammonia, because the salts in the water would combine with the fatty acids of the soap and leave a residue on the clothes. The 1815 female instructor gives instructions to let water stand for 2 to 4 days to allow the mud to settle. Your next concern is getting the right soap. Soap was becoming cheaper to buy, though many still made soap at home. If you do buy your soap, watch out for hard soaps adulterated with earth and resin. Most soaps are sold as cakes that you would still have to leave for a few weeks to dry and harden. You can shred the soap directly into the water, or you can melt it back into jelly overnight. If you need a little extra assistance, you can rub soap directly where it's needed, or add patented washing powders, ammonia, borax, or kerosene. The night before wash day, sort the linens and look for tears and stains. Treat the stains early, as hot water often sets them, and the longer you wait, the harder they will be to remove. All the sources I looked at gave specific instructions for different types of stains, as do many recipe books. You also want to organize things into the divisions in which they are to be washed. By degrees of soiling, white linens, colored clothes, linen, cotton, wools, and flannels. The 1863 laundry manual spends 2 pages extolling the virtues of soaking the linen in lukewarm soap suds to loosen the dirt and save labor and wear. They agree with the American agriculturalist that the great secret of the success of 9 out of 10 of the washing fluids, mixtures, and machines which have been sold over the country for many years past is not owing so much to the inherent qualities of the articles as to the process of soaking, which they invariably recommend. If people pursuing the old-fashioned system of washing will simply take the precaution to throw all the clothes to be washed into water 10 or 15 hours before beginning operations, they will find half the labor of rubbing saved in most cases. Sufficient water should be used to cover the linen without crowding. The suds should be strong enough to raise a good lather when the linens are rubbed or agitated. Castle's Household Guide recommends putting the clothes to soak Saturday afternoon and leaving them till Monday. The best white linens and coarse things should be in separate tubs. Everything should be soaked except colored things, flannels, and woolen materials. When Monday finally arrives, clean and fill your copper so that it can begin to heat. It's recommended to start with the flannels, petticoats and blankets and the like, as they only need pre-dissolved soap jelly. They only need to be washed once, but should be done one item at a time so that they don't spend too much time in the moderately warm water. The water in which the flannels have been rinsed is excellent for the first wash of white linens, the finest first. White things need 2 washings and rinsings. The 1900 laundry manual recommends 1 wash using a washboard on the right side, and the second turned inside out. Next, the colored things should have 2 rubbings and 1 rinsing in clean, cold water. They can be pre-rinsed in water containing salt or vinegar to set the color before washing. Avoid very hot water and rinse in water containing salt, vinegar, or alum to brighten the colors. Woolen garments can be spot treated with a mixture of 1 spoonful of ox gall, 2 spoonfuls of hartshorn, and 2 spoonfuls of alcohol, and then sponged over with a towel wet in cold water. Or you can use store-bought cleansing solutions or water and a little white soap. If you do need to wash the entire garment, it's best to take it apart, removing the lining. The 1863 laundry manual skips the washing and goes straight to boiling. They say, to 10 or 12 gallons of water, add half a pint of good soft soap and 6 ounces of salt soda, or half a pound of salt soda and 6 ounces of good bar soap. And when the water is nearly or quite boiling hot and the soap and soda are entirely dissolved, put in the clothes. Let them boil for 20 or 30 minutes. Then, in order to produce a good color and to remove the soap and soda that have been used, which, if left in, would occasion a disagreeable smell, take them out, preserving the suds as it can be used 2 or 3 times, and put them into a tub of clear, boiling water. Then, after they have been scalded for a few minutes, look them over carefully, and if you find dirt, it can easily be washed out without the use of a washboard. They add, it certainly saves all the laborious rubbing and enables one to complete a heavy wash in a few hours with very little fatigue. Every other source I've looked at recommends boiling after washing, and only for white things, bedsheets, underwear, aprons, etc. They should be put in while the water is still lukewarm. They should be at a rolling boil between 5 and 15 minutes, depending on how dirty they are, and rinsed in cold water. Some only use soap, some add soda, and the earliest source adds stone blue to the boiling and rinsing water. Bluing, of which stone blue is one option, is a separate process in other sources. The soap used in the period often left a yellowish tinge to white fabric. Blue is a complementary color to yellow, and the use of blue dyes creates an optical illusion of whiter white. Stone blue is a mixture of indigo and starch, sold in solid lumps. Other options include straight indigo, which is derived from the leaves of the indigo plant and still used in dyeing today. Prussian blue, the first modern synthetic pigment discovered in 1704, and extremely popular in painting, and ultramarine, originally made by grinding lapis lazuli into a fine powder. It was synthesized in 1826, making it much, much cheaper. It is also a popular paint pigment. For laundry bluing, your chosen pigment should be added to clear, cold water until the water is the required color. Test by holding in the palm of the hand or by bluing a small garment. If Prussian blue is used, your garment should be thoroughly rinsed because the alkali in the soap will react with the iron in the pigment and result in iron rust and a yellowish tinge to the clothes. In all cases, the garments should be shaken, well opened, and maintained in constant motion to avoid the bluing settling into streaks. Best to do this 1 garment at a time. Once everything has been fully wrung, it can be put up to dry. Make sure you clean the lines and pegs. Hanging should be done in the open air. We're lucky in a rural area, we won't have to worry about the dust and soot that fills the air in cities. The sun will additionally bleach white linen. Some people continue the ancient practice of laying things on clean, uncut grass, where the oxygen released by the grass will bleach the underside of the item while the sun works on the top. The sun is, however, destructive to color, so all dyed and printed articles should be hung in the shade. The same is true of freezing. It is beneficial to white linen and cottons, but destructive to colored articles, which should be dried indoors and in cold weather. The last day is reserved for starching and ironing. Starch is the secret ingredient to achieving the smooth, full-bodied silhouettes of the 19th century. It also provides a barrier between the fibers of your garment and any kind of dirt or stain, making them easier to clean. Chemises, corset covers, petticoats, dresses, shirtwaists, lace, men's shirts, collars, cuffs, all would have been starched to varying degrees of shiny stiffness. At the start of the century, the best starch was known as Poland starch, a fine wheat starch, but later you could buy brand name starches. Castle's Household Guide recommends rice starch for wearing apparel generally, and plain flour starch for servants' kitchen gowns. Modern non-spray laundry starch is generally made with cornstarch. Whatever you use, dissolve it into a thick paste with cold water, and then slowly add hot water over heat until it is a clear, smooth consistency. Thinner for dresses, thicker for cuffs and collars. You can then dip your garment in the starch until it is wet. Squeeze out the excess water, and then rub or clap the item between your hands to make sure the starch is spread smoothly. Your garment can then be put out to dry again. Ironing is the step which received the most specific advice in the manuals I looked at, and I unfortunately don't have the time to get into the specifics of different garments, much as I really want to. Instead, I'll focus on irons. Before you start, prepare your irons. Be sure to rub them smooth against the mat until they are very bright, and then rub them with a smooth flannel, which must be done every time they come to the fire. It will be better for the linen that you use the iron as hot as you can. Only take care to dry the iron on a rag lest it damage the linen. The items should also be dampened so that they will iron more easily. The heat and size of your iron depends on the article. Small ones with points for small clothing, heavy ones for tables and bed linens, polishing irons for cuffs and collars. Flannels require heavy, cool iron, and linen can handle higher heat than cotton. Until the late 1870s, the most widely used iron, produced in many different shapes and sizes, had been the sod iron. These ones are mine across the top of the screen. I don't have a scale to weigh them, but they are quite hefty. They would be heated on a piece of sheet metal on the hearth or on the stove. Because they are entirely constructed of iron, the entire thing would become hot. So you need a thick piece of cloth to use the handle. They also don't keep their heat for very long, so you need to continuously reheat. That's why I have two. One stays by the fire while the other is being used. You can also get large hollow irons that can open to allow charcoal to be put inside. In 1893, Mary Florence Potts of Iowa patented the double-pointed sod iron with a detachable wooden handle. The handle would stay cool and could be easily changed with another heated iron base. Just a year later, James Smart Manufacturing Company of Brockville, Ontario, advertised two technologically identical sod irons with detachable handles. One had a black painted finish, and the other, set at a higher price, had a nickel-plated finish. Other irons used gas, kerosene, or gasoline. These certainly eliminated the need to stay next to the stove, but they were not necessarily safer nor produced a better final product. Historian Emily Gannon argues that the metallic, clean look of later irons reflected consumers' modern preferences, an interest not just in technological advancements in the form of new fuel sources, or in easing the labor of ironing, but in the simple aesthetic of progress. Once everything is properly folded and returned to their proper storage, The laundry is finally done. So what's exhausting about the process I've described? Certainly the physical labor, transporting the tubs, boilers, ironing boards, irons, and all the other necessary equipment, maintaining the fire, moving the water from the source to the stove and to the various tubs, moving soaking wet clothing and linens, including in and out of boiling water. If you don't have a wringer, you're trying to squeeze as much water as you can using your bare hands. But there is also the mental labor, the task and resource management. Not only can different fibers tolerate different amount of heat and types of detergent, you have to think about their fineness or coarseness. Are they decorated? Are they dyed? With what kind of dye? How do you treat different kinds of stains? What's the correct amount of starch? What's the correct way to iron and fold complex garments? Is your water too dirty for the next step? Is it going to rain? The advice manuals I looked at were all written for a middle-class female readership. Those who are literate, of course, but also women who might have grown up in households with servants, who are now actively doing or supervising the work for the first time, or who simply weren't trained sufficiently by their mothers. Maintaining at least one servant was increasingly a symbol of middle-class status in cities and rural areas, with many more hiring seasonal or part-time help. In the 1890s and 1900s, there was a growing belief among women like Adelaide Hunter Hoodless that there was a need to communicate scientific and consumer knowledge to and between women. This would grow into mutual aid organizations like the Women's Institute, as well as household science courses from elementary schools to universities. The Women's Institute was founded in 1897 in Stoney Creek, Ontario by Mrs. Hoodless. The organization expanded rapidly throughout Ontario, Canada, to the UK, and around the world. Its original mission was to raise the general standard of living by providing informal education to rural women. Topics could include world events, lobbying around laws relating to women and children, cooking, sewing, home nutrition, childcare, handicrafts, agriculture, banking, and business skills, with the goal to help the individual and their community. At the January 1922 meeting of the Dalmeny branch, just down the road from the museum, Mrs. Donald Stewart read a splendid paper which she had prepared entitled Washing Methods and Cleaning Agents and How to Use Them. Mrs. Stewart gave many helpful hints which would help to lighten what we might almost call the drudgery of the work for farm women. The part of her paper dealing with reducing the labor for farm washing and how to remove fruit, coffee, rust, oil, and various other stains was especially helpful. Adelaide Hoodless also campaigned for the introduction of domestic science education in public schools. Domestic science was the application of scientific management to the home, breaking down all processes to their component parts to increase efficiency, economy, and sanitation. The assumption was explicit. Girls were destined to be homemakers, so they should be trained the way any other profession might be trained. Domestic science training might open opportunities in hospitals, as managers of cafeterias and laboratories, and as financial counselors in banks. But eventually, all would get married, all would have children, all would have a home. Many believe that industrialization dislocated Canadian society and injured traditional institutions, such as the home. Girls increasingly left home to work before marriage, and therefore did not receive the same level of instructions from their mothers. The ambition for providing education for the provincial education department to have fully equipped model homes with the newest technology, sponsored by the manufacturers of domestic appliances, of course. How common that was, especially for rural schools, I still have to research. But the Teacher's Manual for Household Science in Rural Schools, held at the museum's collection, instructs teachers for the ironing lessons, quote, "It will probably be easy to borrow the necessary equipment from homes near the school." Despite attempts to keep school lessons practical, they were often criticized for being too theoretical, too separated from the girls' actual experience of housework. In practice, then as 100 years before now, girls learned at home. In Barbara Riley's study of domestic science education in British Columbia between 1900 and 1930, almost all the women interviewed learned to cook and to perform other housekeeping duties at home, usually at the beginning well before they were old enough to attend domestic science classes at school. In most cases, this was a gradual and informal process. The child started by peeling vegetables, setting the table, and washing or drying dishes, and learned more complex skills so that by age 12 or 13, some could prepare a complete dinner. During the 19th century, wood carving, leatherworking, butchering, men's traditional unpaid contribution to the household economy, were steadily industrialized, subsumed into wage labor, and made available for a price in stores. Men who moved to cities no longer had to manually collect their family's fuel source. They bought wood or coal and eventually paid utility companies for gas and electricity. Agricultural labor rapidly mechanized in the late 19th century. The 20th century has been characterized by the increasing size and specializations of farms. So while men are working outside the home and children are legally required to spend more and more time in schools, the occupations of women do not change in the same way. The industrialization of weaving in the 19th century and the growing dominance of cotton, which was easier to clean than linen and wool, did remove the need to spin and weave at home. But it seems to have been accompanied by an increase in the amount of clothing that people expected to own. This meant an increase in the amount of sewing and the amount of laundry, particularly impacting middle-class women. In the letters and diaries of these women, laundry appears for the first time as a weekly chore. There were brief attempts to maintain cooperative laundries in the early 20th century, and commercial laundries tried to encourage middle-class women to send out the family wash. But for the most part, laundry has remained an individual experience. Thus, the turn to labor-saving machines. The earliest reference to what would become the modern washing machine appears in the 17th century, though it's unclear if they were ever actually manufactured. Washing machines don't appear on the market until the middle of the 18th century. Despite aggressive marketing in the last 2 decades, their adoption was limited to institutional settings, commercial laundries, hospitals, workhouses, and manor houses. It would take another 100 years for them to become widely adopted for home use. Within that time, the variety of forms exploded. In March 1918, journalist Catherine Kent described the main types of machine for the women's section of the Toronto Globe. The dolly, or washboard make, which has 2 corrugated boards for rubbing the dirt out. The revolving cylinder make, which is not unlike the peanut roaster plan, an inner cage holding the clothes and revolving them through the soap and water in the outer cylinder. So many times one way, so many times the other. The pressing and suction washer has cones which come down and press the clothes, and on being lifted, causes suction which draws the dirt. The oscillating kind throws the clothes with the suds in a sort of cradle, and does its work by rapid agitation. The first wringer washer, that is, a combined washing machine and wringer, was patented in 1843 by John E. Turnbull in St. John's, New Brunswick. The top roll was spring-loaded to maintain continuous pressure according to the thickness of the item. They were operated with a crank and gearing system. The machine itself had a dash with slats and perforations, which was manually moved back and forth. He claims you would only need to agitate for 10 to 15 minutes for 2 washes, and that it would remove the need for boiling. Despite this, in advertising for laundry products, the washing machine is depicted about as frequently as the laundry tub by the middle of the 1920s. These machines only really reduce the labor of rubbing garments against a board. A woman still has to fill and empty the tubs. They're not automatic, so she has to supervise the stop and start if it has a motor, and they don't have a spin cycle, so she has to put each garment through the wringer. Liquid detergents are developed in the 1930s, but they only become popular in the 1950s. They reduce the need to scrape and boil the hard soap, and they are much easier to rinse out. Irons were among the first tools to be electrified when a home was hooked up to an electrical grid. They were cheaper than buying a new washing machine, and they were heavily advertised as early as 1902. That year, General Electric offered Canadians to exchange their sat irons for their electric irons, giving away 2,000 electric irons. This does assume you have electricity, and electrification came late to rural Canada. At the turn of the century, public investment built dams, turbines, and distribution networks to supply cities, their street lighting, electric trams, and railways, and heavy industry. It was, however, in the interest of energy companies to expand to domestic users. since it would require substantial additional capital investment and because storing electricity is extremely expensive. Having a large network with maximum power requirements at different times ensures that all of the maximum energy generated is being used and, most importantly, paid for. By 1941, 97% of urban Canadians had electric lighting, and 91% had inside running water. For rural Canadians, 20% had electric lighting and 12% had running water. In Ontario, about 38% of farms were electrified. In Osgood Township, the Osgood Village Library was built with electricity in 1925. Electricity arrived in Kenmore in 1935, and in Vernon, the first 3 farmers connected to the hydroelectric line in 1931. I do specify electric lights because in 1941, the majority of households, urban and rural, across the country were only using enough electricity for lighting. Half of all Canadians were still cooking with wood. By 1951, only Ontario and Manitoba were consuming enough electricity for lighting, refrigeration, and cooking. Interwar, electrification was increasingly seen as a panacea, not only for all ills of rural society, but for Canadian society generally. Appliance retailers and agricultural colleges championed electrification to women's institutes and university home economic departments. So, what was taking so long? For households whose income had fallen substantially with the Depression, installation and usage costs were just too high. Companies offered sliding scale rates that decreased increased usage, but if you don't have electric appliances, your only option was to pay higher costs. If you had electric lights, you could screw a plug outlet into one of the light bulb sockets in the ceiling. But if you wanted more small appliances, or to upgrade to heavy load items like electric stoves, that meant the installation of new and prohibitively expensive wiring. Additionally, service was of poor quality and frequently interrupted in cities, especially in rural areas. It would take until after the Second World War to see mass adoption, a period which saw a falling rural population, which would lead to dramatic changes in rural life that better accommodated electricity. By the 1970s, almost all rural households had electricity and running water. The delay in electrification and indoor plumbing also impacted the adoption of automatic electric washing machines. In 1959, wringer washers outsold automatics 3-1 in Canada. In the US, automatics represented 75% of sales. I described some of the limitations of the wringer washer earlier, but for the new generation, they had established themselves as the technology to have. Some had been converted to attach to farm motors, and others had electric motors which operated the agitator and the wringer, relieving some of the manual labor. Ads of the 1950s emphasized tradition. The firms which made wringer washers were venerable southwestern Ontario and Ottawa Valley manufacturers, begun as foundries and boil works in the 1840s and 50s. They used batch production methods which produced machines that were durable and easy to repair. Not all wringer washers were entirely Canadian. The English washer in the museum's collection was made by the Canadian branch of an American company in the 1940s or 50s. Automatics, however, were quickly dominated by American imports and branches of American companies. They were lighter, less resilient machines, more expensive and difficult to repair. They were manufactured through mass production methods. Production costs were higher due to licensing and import fees, but even in the late 60s, when the Canadian market started to open up, automatic cost 37% more than similar machines in the US. Automatics had the additional hurdle that they were being sold as upgrades. If you already have a wringer washer and you saved up for years to buy, and it still works really well, why buy a new one? Advertisers would highlight the self-acting capacities of the machines, promising to free women for the duration of the wash, and even reduce wash day to 2 or 3 small washes throughout the week. But for the most part, they tried to appeal to a style-conscious consumer. For new homemakers, however, the question wasn't just between 2 laundry technologies, but about the rest of the home. What other tasks might be mechanized? Why buy an automatic when the cost difference for a wringer could mean also buying a vacuum or radio? On a farm, the question was also between the home and the barn, the later of which men could make decisions on their own. Alternatively, investing in an automatic might free a woman for other tasks outside the home. That is not to say that having one inherently meant the woman was working outside. Studies in the 1950s and 60s found that most married women in the labor force came from family in strained circumstances. Researchers Mary Singer and Sue Rogers found that wage-earning mothers in Guelph in the early 1960s were significantly less likely to own automatic machines than those at home full-time. Recessions during the Second World War in the late 1950s meant that most working women, like the washerwomen before them, were not bringing a dual income, but an income. Even as conditions improved in the late 1960s, wringer washers continued to dominate. For historian Joy Parr, these represented a generational divide. The automatic washer is, by design, an autonomous black box. Unlike a wringer washer, you don't see how much water you're pumping from the well. You can't gauge for yourself how much water you need. You don't see the character or the quantity of waste going into the septic field. With an automatic, all this disappears into discrete piping. In 1955, Mrs. H.D.F. Barr of London, Ontario, wrote into a request for ideas for better washers. I have been appalled at the amount of water that seems necessary to do a normal family wash in the new spin-dry type of machine. I believe one brand boasted that it rinsed clothes 7 times, and all of them threw the water out after one use. There's hardly a city or town in Canada that does not have some water shortage in summer months. Large sums are being spent on reforestation, conservation, and dams. It would appear that this trend towards excessive use of water should be checked now. But another generation will come, one that had grown up with mass consumer culture, who prioritized convenience and labor-saving features over resource concerns. But let's go back to my initial questions. Did the board do the work? Until very recently, no, absolutely not. For most of the 19th century, when washboards were predominantly in use, the laundry process required multiple days of heavy work, including at least one full day filling the kitchen with water and soap. By the 1970s, the process had changed. The automatic washers used hot but not boiling water. They didn't soak for as long. Instead of manually filling and cranking the washing machine, women spent their time traveling to and from the grocery store because individual cars had superseded public transportation and delivery. Instead of centralizing cooking, heating, water tanks, and drying closets around the cast iron stove, women are split between multiple rooms and multiple appliances, all separately pulling electricity. We own more and more clothes because they're cheaper and easy to wash. We change the linen more often because we can. We have an automatic washing machine. The work might be less backbreaking, but it's still there. And that change was not equal. It depended on income and infrastructure, on culture and time, but the burden has always remained with women. Thank you very much.
That was wonderful. I feel like that was my second time listening to it, and I feel like I learned, like, I picked up different stuff for sure. So if anyone has any questions, now is the time to ask. Feel free to turn your mic on and ask, or put them in the chat, and I will make sure to let Sarah know. Just while we're waiting for that, I'm wondering, I mean, I know this because we work together. Could you speak a little bit more to some of the experiences that you've had using historical laundry machines and historical techniques?
Yeah. I used to work as a historical interpreter at Fancho Pioneer Village, and part of my interpretation was bringing out a sort of a table full of washboards and plungers, and we had a wringer washer that I could walk people through the steps, how it changed over time, how much labor it took. And that's really where my interest started to crystallize and do more research. I've tried a little bit of starching for lace. It didn't go super well. I obviously now have my own irons, and I'm excited to test out using them.
We have a question in the chat. And so this will be interesting because you've experimented with some of these techniques, but What do you feel is the greatest lost technology or technique with modern laundry?
And I mean, it depends on what you're looking for. If for, I think, like historical costumers, I think what's missing for a lot of people is like starching and ironing.
Mhm.
It was so fundamental. Everybody did it. It applied to anything, everything, from like your bed sheets to your shirt. And I think when we look at some of those early images, it's the thing that we kind of forget was involved. And so when we try and recreate it and we can't quite get there through modern techniques, that there's a little bit of a disconnect. Um, and I mean, for just like an everyday wash, I don't. I like automatic washing machines. I like I want to try out a ringer washer just for the sake of it, but being able to put it in and not have to think about it, I do think not thinking about how much water it takes, how much soap it takes is a detriment.
Mhm.
Um, but it's not necessarily what I want to spend my day doing either. So
Say it's interesting too, the chemistry side of things with the home economic side, the home science, the chemistry for soap making or grass and oxidizing and
mhm.
bleaching your shirts. Like that kind of scientific element, I feel like we also don't. I mean, all of that is very new information for me. I kind of want to try it too. Like, sure, I'll put my white shirts out on the lawn, see what happens.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, dryers are the other thing that are just huge energy sucks and are not very gentle on your clothes. Um, but I think the education is the other thing that I think has disappeared a lot in modern laundry. In places that still have some type of home economics, it's often focused on food and nutrition, which is excellent, and maybe on sewing, but like, what do you do with your clothes afterwards? And we have so many different types of fabrics, and they're not necessarily made in the best way. So that level of education has really disappeared.
We have another question. Why was soap so expensive at one time?
I don't have a specific answer. I think it's such a laborious process, especially if you want to make it at scale. The amount of lye and some kind of fat that you need, and it you go through multiple processes of boiling and solidifying. It didn't scale in the way that modern soaps are able to do, and that made it a lot more expensive to then sell on.
Mhm.
Um, and that is why a lot of families made their own soap. Especially on a farm, if you had a pig where you could get your own fat and you could boil your own lye, that was so much cheaper than having to go to a store where you've got all those layers of wages that need to be spent and sending things out to different stores, which is expensive.
I wonder how it compares to now because our modern liquid detergent, the first ingredient is water. So it's a
Yes.
lot, I would imagine it's a lot less concentrated than historical
Mm-hmm.
solid or gel soaps.
Oh, absolutely. You really were recommended to just like shave off a little bit of soap, and that was, I mean, part of saving up
Mhm.
and not wasting the money that you spent on your soap or the time that you spent on making it. Um, but I did see in one of my sources sort of cautioning that if you went out to buy soap, that there are some manufacturers who put in an increased proportion of water because then when you sell it, it weighs heavier. But when it's sitting in your pantry and it dries off, you suddenly have a lot less soap than what you paid for, which I thought was extremely funny and just it's still there.
Literal shrinkflation. All right, so we're at time. If there's any final questions that you have for Sarah, please let us know in the chat. We'll stay on for a little longer, but otherwise, thank you so much for sharing your research with us. This was really, oh, here we go. Have you ever considered doing an experiment to test a soiled garment with a modern machine versus a dolly?
I would absolutely love to do that. I'm building up my collection. So once I have things like a washing bath or a dolly or a ringer washer, though that takes up a lot of space, I absolutely want to experiment. And I especially want to do with ironing, testing different types of irons, including modern ones. My modern one is sitting on the floor next to me currently. To really be able to see and compare the amount of labor required, not just in the actual pressing, but how efficient it is and how much time you're spent sort of in between pressing. Um,
Yeah, it'd be interesting. I mean, I know in Ottawa at least we have a lot of hard water here, which like that earliest manual from 1815, I believe, mentioned that you
mhm.
can have residue left on your clothes based on the certain reactions. I mean, it wasn't specifically for hard
Yeah,
for soap, but
pretty much all of them mention hard water.
yeah.
It clearly having soft water was not very common.
Yes. Well, something we can connect with our collective ancestors and their laundry struggles. All right, well, I think we'll leave it there. If there's any, Sarah, if you have any final thoughts or closing remarks, thank you everyone for coming out and joining us tonight. I mean, we hope you enjoyed the talk and thank you for supporting the museum.
Thank you all very much. Thank you for coming.